From a very early age, we begin to be shaped, not by choice, but by the need to belong, the search for love, the adaptation to an environment that wasn't always welcoming. Childhood is not just a phase of playful and innocent learning. It is also a period where many emotional wounds silently begin to form. Wounds that, even without us realizing, continue to bleed inside us well into adulthood. Maybe you've felt that some of your reactions are exaggerated, that in certain situations it seems like the one acting isn't really you, but an older, hurt, and confused version of yourself. This feeling has a deep explanation in the theories of Carl Gustav Jung, one of the great names in analytical psychology. For Jung, each of us carries a hidden part of our personality, which he called the shadow. The shadow is not only what we repress for being socially unacceptable. It also contains everything we were forced to abandon in order to be accepted: our truest emotions, our authenticity, our legitimate anger, our vulnerability. What happens is that, to survive emotionally during childhood, we learn to hide parts of who we really are. We do this as a form of protection, an unconscious mechanism of adaptation. So instead of being spontaneous, we become what our parents, caregivers, or society expected us to be. That's why Jung warns us. Much of who we are in adulthood is not an expression of our true essence, but a construction created to withstand the pain, fear, and rejection we experienced back then. This construction, while it protects us, also imprisons us. And the key to freeing ourselves lies precisely in recognizing these wounds, bringing them into the light of consciousness, and gradually integrating what we left behind. It's a courageous process of confronting what hurts, but also of deep transformation. Often we are not who we chose to be, but what we learned to be in order to survive. This phrase summarizes the dilemma of many adults who, when they find themselves repeating patterns of suffering, begin to wonder where it all really comes from. The answer is almost always in the past, in seemingly forgotten experiences, in subtle gestures of neglect, in words said without intent, in absences that left deeper marks than the presences. That's why understanding childhood emotional wounds is so important. They are the starting point to understand why we act the way we do, why we relate the way we do, and why it often feels so hard to fully be ourselves. These wounds, often invisible, become lenses through which we see the world and shape our behaviors, our fears, and even our deepest desires. But most importantly, they are not life sentences. They can be healed. And it's from this awareness that we begin a journey of reconnection with who we really are, beyond the masks, beyond the trauma, beyond the pain. Because only when we face what we've been hiding can we truly transform ourselves. From a young age, we learn to interpret the world based on how we were treated. And when our basic emotional needs are not met, deep marks are left behind. These marks don't fade with time. They turn into emotional wounds that we carry, often unknowingly, throughout our lives. Author Lise Bourbeau identified 5 fundamental wounds: rejection, abandonment, humiliation, betrayal, and injustice. Each of them is born from real or symbolic experiences we've had with authority figures, usually our parents or caregivers, and become the foundation of how we start to deal with the world and with ourselves. The wound of rejection, for example, often arises when a child feels their presence is not wanted. It may have started during pregnancy or in the early months of life when the parents were emotionally unavailable or unprepared to welcome the child. This feeling creates a constant fear of being rejected again, and the adult then grows up trying to make themselves invisible, to hide, avoiding exposure to not risk being turned away once more. Often they develop the unconscious belief that they shouldn't exist, and this idea silently follows them into their relationships and choices. Abandonment is another powerful wound. It's not just about physical absence, but also emotional absence. A child who doesn't feel seen or supported in the moments they need it most develops an intense fear of loneliness. And this can lead, in adult life, to emotional dependence, difficulty being alone, or a relentless search for someone to fill that void left behind. It's a feeling of helplessness that shapes the way this person shows up in relationships, often giving up on themselves to avoid losing the other. Humiliation arises when a child feels exposed, shamed, or excessively criticized for their needs, their body, or their spontaneous expression. This makes them internalize the idea that there is something wrong with them. Later, this pain manifests in low self-esteem, self-censorship, and an immense difficulty in valuing themselves. The adult wounded by humiliation often carries a heavy burden, feeling guilty just for being who they are. The wound of betrayal is born when a child feels someone they trusted has broken that trust. It could have been an unkept promise or the feeling that a parent prioritized other things or people. This creates deep insecurity and the need to control everything around them. This adult grows up distrusting others, wanting to make sure everything is under their command because they deeply fear being deceived or disappointed again. Lastly, the wound of injustice forms when a child feels they're not being treated fairly, that they must work too hard to be recognized, or that their emotions don't have space. This creates rigid perfectionism, relentless self-criticism, and a constant feeling of inadequacy. The adult tries to compensate for this pain by becoming too correct, always demanding from themselves and others an unreachable standard. These 5 wounds, though different, have something in common. They all take us away from who we truly are. Instead of living authentically, we create masks, roles we believe are necessary to be loved, accepted, or respected. Masks of strength, of independence, of extreme kindness, of control, or of justice. But these masks, over time, become prisons. And unless we recognize the origin of these pains, we will continue to live through the defenses we created, not the choices we would truly make if we were free. When these emotional wounds are not understood and healed, they don't disappear. They simply change form. They grow with us, hide within daily life, infiltrate our relationships, decisions, and even how we see ourselves. And without realizing, we begin to repeat the same patterns that often hurt us all over again. The wounded child inside us is still alive, reacting, fearing, defending. And it's usually this child who takes control when we feel emotionally threatened, even if the real danger has long passed. That's why so many people find themselves trapped in self-sabotaging behaviors. They start something with enthusiasm but give up before seeing the results. They form intense emotional connections but pull away when they feel too vulnerable. They have amazing ideas but can't bring them to life because the fear of failure is louder. And all of this is rooted in past wounds, in the unconscious attempt to avoid reliving that original pain. In relationships, these wounds become even more visible. Someone who carries the pain of abandonment, for example, might live anxiously, constantly afraid of being left behind, and therefore act in controlling or suffocating ways. Someone marked by rejection might not even be able to truly open up, always anticipating the moment they'll be excluded again. And so, out of fear of suffering, we end up distancing ourselves from what we most desire: genuine connection. Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This insight is powerful because it invites us to realize that many of the intense reactions we have are not just about others. They're projections. Projections of our own shadow, the unacknowledged parts of ourselves. When someone triggers a disproportionate emotion in us, anger, jealousy, contempt, or fear, there's something there worth exploring. It might be an old pain asking for space to be heard. And this extends to other areas of life. Constant anxiety, the need to control everything, the feeling that nothing is ever enough, are often echoes of unhealed wounds. We live trying to avoid feeling what we felt in childhood again. And in this attempt to escape pain, we miss out on opportunities for growth, love, and inner freedom. Because to keep everything under control, we sacrifice spontaneity, lightness, and even the joy of living. But the crucial point here is to understand that these behaviors are not flaws. They are defenses. They are learned responses. And precisely because they were learned, they can be unlearned. Healing begins when we stop judging ourselves for reacting the way we do and start asking, what inside me still needs to be heard? What part of me is trying to protect itself? When we ask these questions honestly, the path to transformation begins to open. When we don't become aware of these wounds, they continue to operate behind the scenes of our lives. It's as if there were an invisible force guiding our choices, our reactions, our relationships, even when we consciously try to act differently. Jung helps us understand this dynamic through the concept of the shadow, which represents everything that has been repressed, denied, or forgotten within us. The shadow is not an inner villain. It is, in fact, a hidden archive where our unresolved traumas, unacknowledged pain, and also valuable parts of ourselves that were rejected along the way are stored. According to Jung, the unconscious is active. It is not just a passive storage of memories. It acts, organizes experiences, and repeats patterns. It creates situations, not in a magical way, but through our distorted perception of reality. As a result, we end up being drawn to contexts, people, and relationships that symbolically recreate the same wounds from the past. And this doesn't happen out of cruelty or fate, but because there is a natural movement within us toward healing. The unconscious repeats what has not been understood, hoping that finally we can see it clearly and transform it. Have you ever wondered why you keep ending up in the same kinds of relationships? Why you attract people who trigger emotions so similar to those you felt in childhood? This is no coincidence. It's the unconscious trying to resolve what was left unresolved. Every person who hurts us in a familiar way is, unknowingly, touching the same scar. And until we recognize that the scar is ours, we'll keep blaming the other, without realizing the conflict originates within us. The shadow, then, is everything we avoid looking at. But it doesn't disappear by being hidden. On the contrary, it grows stronger. And when we least expect it, it shows up through emotional outbursts, compulsions, impulsive decisions, psychosomatic illnesses, or deep feelings of emptiness. Ignoring the shadow is like ignoring an essential part of our story. And the more we turn away from it, the more we drift from who we really are. That's why the work of integration begins with acknowledgement. Admitting there's something inside us that needs care, attention, and understanding. That's the first step. Jung said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." True transformation doesn't happen by avoiding pain, but by walking through it with presence and honesty. And it's through facing what we most avoid that we begin to break the cycle of repetition. Because in the end, it's not the past that repeats, it's us, unconsciously recreating it until we can finally do it differently. When we understand that these wounds remain alive within us, and that the unconscious makes us relive them so we can transform them, a new question begins to emerge. How do we heal? How do we break the cycle, integrate the shadow, and finally start living from who we truly are, not from the defenses we learned to build? Carl Jung called this process individuation, a deep path of self-knowledge that invites us to integrate all the parts that make up our being, including the ones we avoid, repress, or reject. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. It's about looking at our own story with honesty, embracing our inner contradictions, and reclaiming everything that was left behind in the name of emotional survival. It's a journey that requires courage, but that also gives us back our power. And it's not just about intellectual understanding. Healing requires presence. It requires a willingness to feel, to connect with old emotions that may have never had space to exist. That's why one of the most powerful tools on this path is psychotherapy, especially the kind that goes beyond symptoms and explores the emotional roots of pain. With the support of a qualified professional, we can begin to recognize the internal narratives we've carried since childhood and gradually rewrite them. Another powerful practice is journaling, or therapeutic writing. By writing about our experiences, feelings, and memories, we give shape to what was once just a vague sensation. Writing helps us organize inner chaos and often reveals aspects that were outside our awareness. It's a way to speak to parts of ourselves that have long been silenced. Dreams are also important allies in this process. Jung believed that dreams are direct manifestations of the unconscious, and in them, the shadow often appears symbolically. Paying attention to dreams, writing them down, and reflecting on their meanings is a way to establish dialogue with what has not yet been integrated. The unconscious speaks to us constantly. The challenge is learning how to listen. Meditation and inner silence also play a role. When we quiet the noise of the external world, we can begin to hear the subtle voice that comes from within. It's not about emptying the mind, but about creating space for emotions to surface without judgment. In that space, clarity often emerges about where pain still resides and what needs to be acknowledged. And perhaps the most challenging, and at the same time the most transformative, step is the encounter with the past. Not to relive it, but to see it with new eyes. Reconciling with who we were, with what we felt, with the parents we had, or didn't have the way we needed, is an essential step. This doesn't mean approving everything that happened, but understanding that the experiences we lived are part of who we are today, and that healing begins when we stop fighting our story and start integrating it. Because accepting the shadow is not surrendering to pain, it's making space for it to transform. When we look at our wounds with compassion, they cease to be prisons and become passages. Passages to a more authentic, freer, and truer version of ourselves. And when this process begins to unfold, when we look inward, recognize the wounds, embrace the shadow, and consciously walk the path of individuation, something subtle but deeply transformative starts to emerge. Freedom. Not the illusory freedom of doing whatever we want at any cost, but the real freedom of being who we are, without needing to hide behind the defenses we built in the past. Healing childhood wounds is, above all, an act of liberation. It's saying, I am no longer that child trapped in fear, in absence, in pain. I can take care of myself now, with maturity, with presence. And this is not a quick or linear process. There are days when it feels like we've taken great strides. On others, everything seems to regress. But that's part of the journey. The important thing is to remember that every step toward inner truth is also a step away from unconscious repetition. And that, in itself, is already a form of healing. We're not seeking perfection. We're seeking integration. And to integrate means to allow ourselves to be whole, with both light and shadow, strength and fragility. Many people avoid this inner dive because they're afraid of what they might find. They think that if they face the pain, it will consume them. But the opposite is true. What really traps us is what we hide. What we avoid is what holds the most power over us. Jung expressed this clearly when he said, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms." Acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It means recognition. It's facing what hurts, not to suffer again, but to give that pain a new direction. As we learn to tend to our inner wounds, we begin to change the way we relate to the world. Relationships become more genuine, less reactive. Decisions come from a more centered place. Life starts to make more sense, not because everything is resolved externally, but because something is becoming organized internally. We begin to act no longer from lack, but from awareness. And that shift changes everything. Maybe today you're just beginning to become aware of your own wounds. Maybe some of them already have names. Maybe others are still hidden beneath layers of denial. But the fact that you're here, reflecting on this, is already a step, an important step. Because we can only heal what we recognize. We can only transform what we have the courage to face. So make that choice for yourself. Give attention to the child you once were, and who still lives somewhere inside you. Rewrite the story that keeps repeating itself. Don't wait for the world to heal you. It only reflects what's already inside. True healing begins when you commit to your own truth. And that journey, as challenging as it may be, is also deeply liberating. You are not broken. You are in process. And that process is what brings you back home, to yourself. If this content helped you see something in yourself, leave a like below. It shows me that this kind of reflection resonates with you. And if you want to continue this journey of self-knowledge and healing, subscribe to the channel. We still have a long road ahead, and it can be lighter when walked together.